Hiya folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and someone left a comment a few videos back saying Pikachu without a head looks like a head crab, so naturally in my mind interpreted that as a face hugger from Alien, and one thing led to another, and here we are, making Diglett bursting out of Ash Ketchum's chest like a xenomorph baby. Of course, if that's what we're making, then we may as well start at the worst part first, an anime face. Longtime viewers of the channel will know that I don't make a lot of anime characters because their faces are hard and I try to avoid anything that's even mildly challenging. I find with an anime face the trick is making it a soft, simple lump and painting the detail on later, but for someone like me who doesn't generally enjoy painting and likes to leave fingerprints in all his sculptures, this tactic never worked particularly well. I mean, you only have to look back at the plethora of Legend of Zelda lonks I've made to see that there's a theme I tend towards, and that theme is...
It's hideous!
So with that in mind, I should probably just stop here and paint the rest of it on later, but I'm nothing if not stuck in my ways and unwilling to change. I will, however, try and work around my inclination to not leaving things be by making the most shocked and horrified version of Ash Ketchum I possibly can, which I think is probably reasonable given the eventual end product. So once I've made a big horrified screamy mouth, I can start to plot out his eyes before going back to the mouth to add at least one row of teeth, since this seems to be an anime staple: top teeth, no bottom teeth. Now with my top tooth row in place, I can start the ever important enwrinkling process I was just saying that I should be actively avoiding. However, much like my inability to change, I'm also not willing to listen to advice, even when it's my own. With the wrinkles in place, I'll add the lumpy eyebrow lumps that aren't actually his eyebrows, but they're like the lumps that go under the eyebrows, which then house the big bushy eyebrows on top. I can then stick a couple simple circle-looking ears onto the side of his head, and that's the worst of it done, so it's onto the smoothing, which starts with a heavy soaking in isopropyl alcohol to soften the clay so I can brush away the fingerprints. Then once I've removed the excess clay from the neck and baked the head to save my progress, I can start adding the hair on top, leaving a big bald patch in the center like Friar Tuck for his hat, which I've made by baking the brim ahead of time in the oven so I can glue it in place and build the rest of the dome in a couple of layers, smoothing and blending and shaping as I go until I've got a semi-hat looking thing on top of his head. I'll add the seams around the edge, then fill the back of the hat where I've added the hole with some more hair, and it's into the oven again to bake before bending the spine down so he's looking at his chest. With the head done, I can get to work making the rest of his body now by attaching some looped armature wire to the spine with a bit of aluminium tape, then I can bend the legs into a kneeling position. Originally, I was going to have him in a chair falling backwards, but I ended up going with him kneeling in a patch of grass because... I don't know, I mean, why do I do any of the things I do? His arms, much like his legs, are a length of armature wire attached with aluminium tape and angled appropriately. Otherwise, with the skeleton sorted out, I can finally get started bulking up the body. I'll wrap everything but the arms in an initial layer of clay, leaving the arms uncovered for no real reason apart from the fact that that's apparently what I did this time, and once it's all covered in a thin layer of clay, I can start to smooth and blend the seams together before getting to work thickening up the various body parts, starting from the bottom. Mr. Ketchup has a pair of pretty basic blue anime sneakers, but I've angled the feet in such a way that the treads of the shoe will be the most visible part, so naturally I'll forget to record myself adding that detail, instead focusing the majority of this part of the video on the part of the shoes that are basically invisible once he's kneeling in the grass. After the shoes are in place, I can get to work building up his blue jeans by wrapping the legs in another, thicker layer of clay, getting the overall blue jean shape in place before breaking out my all-time favorite miniature blue jean texturing tool, a bit of off-cut curtain. I'll press this gently into the surface of my freshly smoothed clay, then once I've got a bit of texture in place, I can start adding the various seams and pockets to the pant legs before working my way onto the enwrinkling process by adding lots of little wormy dealies strategically placed all over. I'll then slowly work my way around each of these little leg sausages, blending them into the legs to create some smooth, soft ripples that I can then enwrinkle with the help of a sculpting tool so they've got a sharper, more wrinkled blue jean-like look. Finally, to add that denim texture back to the fresh wrinkles, I'll press the curtain offcut into the surface and redraw my seams and pockets where appropriate. With that, Ash's pants are done and I can add his belt, buckle, and an adequate number of belt loops before adding the rolled up pant legs to the bottom of his pants and wrapping the arms in the inexplicably absent layer of clay from earlier. Then it's into the oven again before getting to work making his undershirt, which starts as a simple soft flat slab of clay into which I can add Diglett. Of course, that means I need to make Diglett first, who starts as a torpedo-shaped tube that I'll add a little oblong egg to the center of before adding the eyes and... well, that's it. That's Diglett. I'll then make a Diglett-sized hole in Ash's chest so I can press Diglett into it. Of course, because he's bursting forth, I need to make some torn fabric, which I made by rolling an extra flat sheet of clay and tearing it apart, which makes for some terrific looking torn texture. However, make sure you enjoy this texture now, since throughout the rest of the build, I'm going to be periodically knocking it all off to the point where none of it actually shows up in the final build. Otherwise, I can push Ash to the back and start getting handsy. Now I pretty much make all my hands the same way, starting out with a little lump that I'll smoosh flat and cut a set of fingers into. Some pinching and rolling will make my fingers, but because Ash is wearing fingerless gloves, I'll use a pair of flat tweezers to press the bottom of the fingers flat so I can demarcate the end of the glove. I can then add a fat thumb to one side and add the same exposed digit before using some silicone-tipped tweezers to add some shape and detail to the fingers and knuckles before adding the fingernails to the tips of each finger. A little divot pressed into the bottom of the hand will give me space to stick it into the arm nubs, and I can repeat this process for the other hand before wrapping the joint in a length of clay to create the bottom of the glove. All that's left to do then is position the fingers, and that's a pair of perfectly acceptable hands done in less time than it would take you to catch a shiny Arceus. Once the body's been baked for a fourth time, I can remove Diglett, revealing the big chest cavity beneath, making it easier to add the overcoat t-shirt thing on top. I'll make this in a few sections, being sure to blend out any of the seams so it looks like a single solid piece of fabric draped around the body, pinching the bottom of the jacket out to create some movement and flow. I'll add the little square thing to one side, then add the sleeves and the collar before using my tweezers and a tool to create the edging. A final full blasting of alcohol will help to remove some of the fingerprints, and I can add the pockets and buttons and bake Ash one final time. However, with Diglett back in place, we're almost done, but it feels like I'm missing something. An equally shocked yellow shock rat looking over Ash's shoulder. To make said shock rat, I'll take a peanut-shaped lump of clay and add a little round head to one end, then push and press the clay around until it kinda looks like a featureless Pikachu face. I'll then poke a big divot into the front of said face to make my Pikachu less shocked and more horrified, and I can add some little green eyes and start to build up the rest of the head. Much like I did with Ash, I'm going to be leaning into the wrinkles to express that horrified countenance most likely on display as a friendly little brown tube comes bursting out of the middle of Ash's chest. With that horrified face finished, I can add some ears to the top of Pikachu's head, then add some big thick-thighed legs to his backside and some smaller, simpler little legs to his front. The front feet get a set of 5 toes and the back legs get some long triplets, and I can position the still soft body on Ash's shoulder to figure out where his little legs should be positioned. Once I'm happy with how his little legs sit, it's into the oven to bake before rolling out a thick slab of clay so I can make his lightning bolt tail. I'll trace the shape with Pikachu as a reference for scale, then once I've cut the shape out, I'll carve a groove down the center of the tail so I can fit an appropriately angled armature wire that I can embed in the middle. Once the wire's hidden and I've somewhat smoothed the tail, I can fit it into a pre-drilled hole in Pikachu's butt, then blend that into the body and bake it all once more. With the tail baked and solid, I can finally bend it into its final position thanks to the armature wire inside. With that, Pikachu's finished, and I can fit him onto Ash's shoulder and fit Diglett into Ash's chest. Oh, and I also made a little Pokeball too. With my Pokeball in place, this little grayscale horror scene is all but finished, and all that's really left to do is add a little color. I'm going to use the airbrush to lay down some initial base coats in the hope that I can save a little time in the long run. In hindsight, I really ought to have used colored clay to do this sculpt since there's so many layers and they've all got distinct coloring, which is where the colored clay really shines. However, I didn't, so an initial blast with the airbrush will have to do. I'm not so worried about overspray since I'll clean it up later. I just want to get some of the larger sections covered in something as quickly as I can. Also, when it comes to skin tones, I find the lighter skin tones are an absolute nightmare to get on evenly without an airbrush, so I'll do that last. And while I have the airbrush out, I may as well give Diglett a once-over too. Before I get on to cleaning up the overspray, I'm gonna take advantage of the messy paint job and give all of Ash's fleshy bits a couple of aggressively dry brushed, progressively lighter flesh tones to add a bit of depth, leaving the darker base coats in all of the wrinkles and around the edges of his hair and clothes for some easy shading. With the skin brush to a blotchy hue, I can start to work my way around the body, cleaning up the edges of the initial airbrush base coating, painting the larger sections first. I want the blue jeans to be a light blue, so I'll give them a full once over with a lighter blue. Then I can give his jacket a magic blue base coat and add some texture by adding lots of strokes of varying shades of that same color, letting it mix and blend as it wants. At this point, the blue jeans have dried enough that I can start to work my way through a series of blues with more and more white added to desaturate the color, which, once dry brushed over the darker base coat, should give those jeans a nice worn out look. I'll then go back to the coat and add the yellow trim around the edges and on the pockets and buttons before moving inside to the t-shirt to add some lighter green highlights that I'll then carry out to his gloves with an initial dry brushing followed by lighter and lighter highlights with the brush. With the larger sections finished, I can start to clean up the smaller parts, which seem to be mostly shades of white, so I'll take my time cleaning up these parts with several coats of white before eventually working my way up to the hat, which will get a base coat in darker red, followed by some aggressive stippling of lighter red to add some texture. Then it's down to the hair, which all gets a black base coat followed by a not quite black but pretty much still black gray highlight, and I can rim the eyes in black before painting them pure white. While I wait for the white to dry, I'll paint the inside of his mouth and tongue with a mouth and tongue appropriate pinky purple, then I can paint the symbol on his hat and draw on his pupils. Except I forgot to record that part apparently, since I can't find the footage of me doing it. So instead I'll skip ahead to me dotting the eyes with teeny tiny white dots, and that's Ash all but done, so I'll set him aside and start stippling various shades of yellow all over Pikachu's body to create a semi-furry texture that I can then start to add what little detail he has over top. I'll add his brown markings to his back and to the base of his tail before touching up the tips of his ears in black and doing the same for his eyes and nose. I can then use a cotton bud dipped in red to color his cheeks. Once his tongue's been painted tongue pink, I can add the dots to his eyes, which I'll add down at the bottom this time to give the impression that he's looking down at Diglett, and I can set him aside and move on to painting the Pokeball, which gets black down the center of the ball to delineate the two halves. I'll then paint red on the top and white on the bottom, then it's back to the red to stipple some lighter red for shading, and all that's left to do is give Diglett a little lighter initial brushing before painting his eyes black and his nose a couple shades of pink. His eyes will also get some little white dots, then I can finally give both Ash and Pikachu's eyes a couple coats of UV resin to make them nice and wet, and that's the whole team finished and ready for a base. I figured a proper basic base would work best because there's so much going on up top, so I've cut a little foam square that I'll cover in my homemade mud, which is 1 part hole filler, 1 part glue, and 1 part brown paint. Once I'd mixed it up, it wasn't quite as dark as I had wanted, so I decided to add 1 part dark sand and 1 part darker brown paint, then give that a nice mixing up, and once it's been adequately mixed up, I can slap it onto the base all willy-nilly, dragging it up and over the edges. I'll then set this aside to dry before coating the top in a layer of PVA glue so I can add a thick layer of static grass followed by another even thicker layer of static grass. A quick flip and tap will dislodge the leftover bits of grass, and I'm left with a lovely little grass square that I can set my kneeling Ash into. Now, up until now, I had wondered if I had wanted to go down this route given the pure innocence of Pokemon, but Halloween is coming and a chest burster is, by definition, bursting out of a chest, so I'm gonna need some goopy blood. And to make said blood, I'll mix some red ink and Fabri-Tac. Adding a little red ink to my Fabri-Tac will tint this goopy glue and create a comically red, upsettingly stringy substance that I can use to stick Diglett into place, then string back and forth around the base of the brown chest torpedo to imply that it's exited Ash's body with a high degree of enthusiasm. All that's left to do then is pop Pikachu onto Ash's shoulder looking down in abject horror and drop the little Pokeball to the side, and that's us done here and onto the Glamour Shots. As always, a big ol' thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon, and a special hey how are you to the newest of them. Lucida Sidera, Gemma, Felix and Lara enjoy watching Adam make tiny nerdy things, Connor Dyer, happy birthday Finn, Zach DeLeon, I love James Naylor, the third Space Sharks are Ban, Love Io, Jalen Jones, and Svarty. You are the little brown torpedo monster that bursts forth from this channel's chest. What do you think of a proper horror Pokemon crossover? Has science gone too far? Let me know down below, and if you intrigue me enough with your comment, maybe it'll be the basis for a terrible video. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.